So, what is pulping and what does it have to do with comics? Well, let me explain. Hey there, this is Perch. A lot of people have asked, I've used this term pulping, particularly with the newsstand and comics back in the 70s and 80s. I've said that comics were pulped, and people ask, well, what does this mean? And then on top of that, when I've explained it, it's, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone do that? That doesn't make any business sense. But it does. It's important, though, that people understand what pulping is, what returnability meant, and why there were such bigger numbers on the newsstand, but why those numbers are misleading and what numbers you should actually pay attention to. So let me break it down on just a simple level. Pulping is basically the practice where the content that's not sold, the product that isn't sold, the comics, the cover is ripped off, the comic itself is pitched, recycled, dumped, thrown into the garbage, wherever it happens to go. And then the cover is returned as proof of basically that the comic has been destroyed. So that in a nutshell is pulping. Now there's a bunch of kind of variants to that explanation, but that gives you enough of an understanding of what the practice was. So now the comment is, well, why in the world would you do that? Well, first, what do you mean? Why rip the comic up? Well, because it was a lot cheaper, frankly, to return the covers than the entire comic. Just in terms of raw weight, it was much simpler to go through and to recognize. This is a practice that is pretty common in magazines and even books to some extent. It's not uncommon for this to happen with actual books. Does this mean that you could hide out behind the comic store and secretly watch them dump a bunch of comics and then get stuff for free? Yeah, if a lot of people did do that. In fact, I remember that back in the late 70s, 80s, some stores would have kids, like wash the windows or do kind of minor cleanup jobs, and they could just take whatever of the pulped content they wanted home, and that was a thing that people could do. That's why sometimes if you look at back issue collections of people, you'll find a bunch of comics without covers. If you ever go to a flea market or something like that, you'll come across this. It's cool. It's part of being a child, of growing up in the 70s and 80s. But in terms of what the point of that was, like I said, it was just to prove that the comic wasn't purchased and therefore destroyed, and basically the shop would get charged for it. Um, so why in the world would you do this? Some people have claimed that pulping was fictional because this makes no business sense for a company. And the answer is, well, it was partly about just getting distribution out there, getting comics as many places as could be seen, because the more places the comics were seen, if the comics were always available as a shelf product, just like soap and cereal and anything else you might find in a grocery store, then more people will buy comics. If they're omnipresent, then that's good. But comics aren't like soap or cereal. They're not a required good. Hopefully, soap is a required good for people. But it basically it was a way to give a risk-free product to the stores, and it aligned with how other things in the market, magazines and other things, were going. The store needed to carry magazines. They couldn't afford to take the risks that the direct market takes, so they just buy it outright. So that was the business model for these stores. They would, provide shelf space, and they would market and advertise because that was good for their clientele, and they would get a smaller percentage of the comics, basically of the sale. But it was a business model that worked out, particularly if you were a large chain like a 7-Eleven or a Safeway or something like that, where you're ordering, 100, 200,000 comics. One of those places probably isn't ordering that much, but you're just ordering a lot of comics, and they're spread out across the whole newsstand. It's also a reason why, sort of a reason why. I don't want to mislead people here, but it's part of the reason why on the newsstand back in the 80s, the comics would be later than what you might get if you were a subscriber, sort of, sometimes, or ultimately the direct market. The direct market, we're getting the comics directly. The big box chains are getting the comics to a distribution center. The distribution center was then distributing them to the stores. So it wasn't the same kind of day and date delivery. So why does this matter now? Well, only from the standpoint of some people like to play funny math with the numbers of sales in comics. And one thing that I hear said quite a bit is, Marvel was selling, you know, 400, 500,000 copies of a comic back in the 80s. And now they're lucky to get, 40, 50,000, thousand sold. And it's just proof that comics have imploded and gone into the hole. And that's a misleading number because, as I just said, a lot of those comics are getting pulped. In many cases, the majority of comics are getting pulped. More comics were being destroyed than were being sold through in the direct market. So if you just go unit shipped as your number, then you're painting a pretty inaccurate picture. That's not indicative of where the comic market is then or today, because those comics weren't getting into the hands of people, or at least they weren't generating cash. So, but there is something about the way it was done in the 70s and 80s that does matter for today. And an example of that is simply comics were more places. And because they were more places, more comics did sell. If that makes any sense, it's that it was wasteful, sure. But if you distributed 200,000 copies of Spider-Man to gas stations and grocery stores and everywhere else, then some percentage of those are going to get sold. Granted, it was a very wasteful practice in the sense that, if 1 out of 10 of those comics got sold, 90% are being pulped. Wasn't quite that high. But if that was the model, that's pretty wasteful. To get that one customer, you're basically printing and then trashing 9 comics. But it was still good for visibility. In that sense, it's good from a marketing perspective. So more comics were sold back in the 70s to the 80s, actually sold to people where cash exchanged hands, but it came at a huge cost. And that cost was basically a lot of pulping, a lot of returnability of comics. So it wasn't necessarily an efficient model. The direct market today is more efficient, but it is also in many cases selling less comics. But the price point's also higher too. So if all of this is making sense, it's simply that you have comics, once upon a time, they went everywhere, and a lot of them never were sold. But what was sold was higher than today because there were just more places you could buy comics. They were catching more people. I mean, think about the purchase of an 8-year-old kid in a grocery store with their parents. Parents are off buying the cereal and the soap, and the 8-year-old kid goes, "Hey, I want this comic." And parent looks at it and it's like, "Okay, 45, 35 cents, okay." And they'd throw it in the basket and the kid would get a comic. So that was a comic sold. Today, that whole process doesn't exist. Or rather, it's still happening, just not with comics. It's happening with some other thing the kid found in the store. Or more likely, the kid's got the parent's cell phone and is just kind of playing a game there that they found for free, and nobody's looking at anything. But that's a whole other topic. So it's important that people understand this, because a lot of people will say, "Hey, we need to go back to the 70s and 80s, and what Jim Shooter did with comics and everything else." But that model wouldn't work the same way today. Parts of it would, and parts of it are, I think, really important. We ought to figure out how to do that. Namely, how do you get comics more places so they can be seen? That should be something definitely people are thinking about. And it probably is a good time to think about, do you want to start putting more comics into the market than you're selling? Simply from the standpoint of let's lean into this idea of marketing with some returnability. It's probably a good time to get visibility on comics and do that, even if it means some waste. But it doesn't have to mean waste, because we do have a slowly growing digital field, and giving away comics for free or at a highly discounted price on digital in order to get more distribution up is probably not a terrible idea. Now, digital doesn't have its own distribution, so that's not a great idea today, but in 5 years it might be. So it is time for the comic companies to start looking to the 70s and 80s and saying, "Hey, what worked there?" But it's also parts that wouldn't work. There's fewer people just hanging out at the grocery store. The kid is looking at the cell phone. People don't go into gas stations anymore. There's a lot of places that comics were seen and found that are not places people would see and find comics today. So we have to look, where are the places that kids are hanging out? And that's where that effort needs to go. But anyway, that's just a fairly brief explanation. That's what pulping is. That's the practice. It's still done today with other things, with other kind of magazines and periodicals. It's just it's the whole market there is not what it was during the 70s and 80s. There's a lot more ways to consume content. Why get your news from a magazine when you can go on your phone and see TMZ immediately? You don't have to wait the 2 weeks or whatever for something to be made, printed, and distributed. It's a different world now. So we have to take advantage of that. Anyway, do you have any questions on this? Does that make sense? Leave me a comment below. Hope that helped. Like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch, and thanks for listening.